Welcome. This is James Corbett of the Corbett Report with your eye-opener report from BoilingFrogsPost.com on this 22nd day of August 2011. Violence continues to rock Afghanistan this week as two more government officials were gunned down yesterday, including a prosecutor in Helmand province and an agricultural officer in Kandahar. The attacks come after a series of high-profile incidents, including the assassination of Afghan President Hamid Karzai's half-brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, last month, and a daring attack on the British Council compound last Friday.
Taliban suicide bombers have stormed the British Council charity in the Afghan capital Kabul, killing at least 8 people and wounding another 10. One report says 12 have died. It's thought most of those killed are policemen. The Afghan government says at least 1 or 2 of the casualties are foreigners. The Taliban said it was sending 2 messages, one to the Afghan government and another to the British, on the day the country marks its independence from British rule.
The recent uptick in violence comes precisely as NATO is beginning the process of handing control over to local authorities. In late June, Obama, Cameron, and Sarkozy announced the beginning of a withdrawal that would see a drawdown in US and French troops this year, and a pledge that UK forces be removed from combat duty entirely in Afghanistan by 2015. In late July, shortly before the wave of assassinations began, NATO handed over security operations in the relatively peaceful provinces of Bamiyan and the cities of Lashkar Gah and Maidar Lam to local security forces. The upsurge in violence, however, cast doubt on the ability of Afghan forces to take on the task of policing the chaotic areas of Helmand and Kandahar, and some have already used recent attacks to call for rethinking these withdrawal plans. Although the Western media has been quick to attribute these attacks to the Taliban, it is unclear how the interests of the Taliban, who ostensibly want to take control of the country, would be served by disrupting NATO's withdrawal plans. Instead, some critics are alleging that NATO in fact has no plans to withdraw forces from Afghanistan, and the violence may in fact be being incited to give NATO an excuse to stay in the country. The assassination of Ahmed Wali Karzai, for instance, was treated as a Taliban hit, with the Washington Post setting the tone of the official story with a confused article headlined, "Ahmed Wali Karzai's killer had been a Taliban foe," despite going on to claim without proof that Sardar Mohammed had somehow been recruited by the Taliban to kill Karzai. A more coherent picture emerged when it became known that Mohammed in fact ran a network of spies reporting to the CIA, and that no less than 2 of his brothers-in-law worked directly for the CIA. Combined with the fact that Karzai himself had been exposed as having been on the CIA payroll at the same time as he was a major drug dealer in Kandahar, and that his relationship with the agency had soured in 2008 when his CIA links were exposed, and the facts more closely suggest a CIA-sponsored or aided hit than the idea that Mohammed had been miraculously converted by the Taliban and sent on a suicidal assassin mission. As critics note, however, the idea of a ubiquitous Taliban presence in Afghanistan is needed in order to ensure the continued occupation of the country by NATO forces long past the 2015 deadline for the handover of combat operations. Numerous reasons have been suggested as to why the occupation of Afghanistan is important to the West, from its geostrategic importance to its mineral wealth. But one of the most compelling is the fact that the country now produces as much as 92% of the world's supply of opium. The Afghan poppy crop brings in about $1 billion for the opium farmers themselves, or about $5,000 per family annually. $3 billion goes to the Afghan government officials, insurgents, warlords, and traffickers, and the street value of the drugs produced from the opium, however, is estimated to be as much as $200 billion a year, with the vast majority of that being laundered through the US banking system. The idea that the drug trade in Afghanistan is enabled and protected by Western interests for their own benefit is by no means a new or controversial idea. Charts showing opium production in Afghanistan revealed that the opium crop was almost entirely eliminated by the Taliban during the year that they banned opium cultivation, with the charts spiking to record highs during the years of NATO occupation. Late last month, I had the chance to talk to Professor Peter Dale Scott, the author of such works as Drugs, Oil, and War, The United States in Afghanistan, Colombia, and Indochina, and American War Machine, Deep Politics, The CIA Global Drug Connection, and The Road to Afghanistan. I asked him about who is behind the refinement of Afghan opium into heroin, and how they profit from the international drug trade.
I can't name groups, but I've thought a lot about this, and what I'm saying now is a bit speculative, but I think it holds up. This all began, the first processing was done by Europeans and, according to the French, Americans who started coming to Afghanistan in the 1970s. Now, if we think about what was happening in the 1970s, America was pulling out of Indochina. Up until then, Burma, Laos, northern Thailand, the so-called Golden Triangle, it had totally dominated the global production of opium. But as the Americans pulled out, the political system that protected the traffickers and so on was beginning to collapse. And it's quite striking that as the Americans pulled out of Vietnam, opium production in the Triangle went down, and at the same time, simultaneously, opium production in the Golden Crescent, between the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, began to increase. And the same pattern again repeated in the 90s. You still had a certain amount of opium production in the 1990s in the Golden Triangle, but there was a very energetic UN-backed program to do crop substitution and to eliminate opium production in the Triangle. You cannot say it's been eliminated, but in the 90s it did go down. And the interesting thing is, and here the statistics are really remarkable, as it went down in the Triangle, it increased in the Golden Crescent, so that the total production between the two areas was roughly the same. Why do I stress that? Because it seems to me that the real impetus for all of this is not coming locally from indigenous elements in either one place or the other, but it is coming from a global drug trade that is probably Western-based and was certainly clearly, I write about this in American War Machine, with the advantage of historical retrospection, we see how important the CIA was for the building up of, because it was an enormous increase initially, right after the war, of drug production in the Golden Triangle. The CIA is probably the primary reason why you saw such dramatic increase in production. And so we have to ask ourselves, why are we now looking at the Golden Crescent, where, again, drug production increased at the same time that CIA involvement increased? They always say it was indirect through ISI, but it was still, I mean, America put billions of dollars into Afghanistan in the 1980s, and it went, the two groups, Abu Sayyaf and Hekmatyar's group, Hezb-e Islami, which were, because they were not very popular in Afghanistan, they compensated for that by using the drug trade to build up their power. So we have to, if we really are saying, what are we going to do about drugs in Afghanistan, we have to look at these external forces. We have to look at Washington, I'm afraid, and do something there. Legalize drugs, certainly legalize marijuana as a first step, and the solutions to this drug crisis will come on the demand side, because you can take the profits out of the drug trade by legalizing it.
Adding to the conclusion that the protection of the global drug trade is in fact a key aim of the NATO occupiers, this week it was announced that US Training Center Inc., a subsidiary of Blackwater International, has just been awarded a contract by the Pentagon for counter-narco-terrorism activities in Afghanistan. How exactly a firm that is notorious for claims of its involvement in murder, weapons smuggling, money laundering, child prostitution, and schemes to deliberately overcharge the Pentagon for its services could possibly be of use in counter-narco-terrorism activities is not clear. However, the fact that the US military's officially acknowledged policy is now to help the Afghan farmers grow and cultivate their poppy crop makes the involvement of an arm's-length military contractor of dubious integrity all the more understandable.
The Taliban finances much of its operations by selling opium, which is grown from poppies, which are right now being harvested. So here's the question: why are American troops now helping Afghan farmers grow that opium?
Let me introduce Lieutenant Colonel Brian Christmas. He's the commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines. Really a wonderful group of Marines here. I know that you care deeply about this contradiction, the fact that here you have one of the best fighting forces in the world ever mounted, and in a sense you're watching as this opium is being grown. I know it grinds at your gut. How do you deal with it? What are you doing about it?
Well, frankly, this is a part of their culture. So while it might grind in my gut, it's what they do. We provide them security, we're providing them resources, and we're providing them alternatives.
What these reports expose is that, exactly contrary to government talking points about the poppy trade helping the Taliban, who in fact almost succeeded in eradicating opium production in the country during their rule, the crop is in fact being grown, cultivated, and sold under the watchful eyes of NATO troops. This is not an incidental role for coalition troops in the region, but in fact a vital one, helping to prop up what has been estimated to be the 3rd most lucrative commodity in the world behind oil and the arms trade. The total value of the global drug trade has been estimated at between $0.5 and $1.5 trillion annually, with Professor Scott noting in his book American War Machine that about half of that is funneled through US banks each year. In 2001, a US Senate investigation found that tens of billions of dollars of drug money were being laundered through US banks each year via a dimly policed shadow financial system known as correspondent banking. In 2006, a DC-9 carrying 5.7 tons of cocaine, valued at $100 million, crashed near the Gulf of Mexico. An investigation found that the money had been purchased with funds laundered through Wachovia, and the US DEA, IRS, and others unwound billions of dollars in drug money that had been laundered through the bank. Charges were brought against Wachovia, now a part of Wells Fargo, but the case was settled before coming to court. In the end, the bank was shown to have laundered over $378 billion in illicit funds and ended up paying $160 million in fines and forfeitures. In 2008, the director of the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes noted that US banks, under pressure from the liquidity crisis of that year, in fact used laundered drug money in order to stay solvent. Given the central importance of the drug trade to the world economy, it should come as little surprise that US forces in Afghanistan are being ordered to guard the poppy fields, not eradicate them. And given that private contractors like Blackwater are now being hired to participate in Pentagon-funded counter-narco-terrorism activities, look for Afghan opium exports to hit record highs once again this year.
This video is part of a new weekly video news series. Future editions of this series will be available to subscribers of BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more news and commentary from James Corbett, please visit CorbettReport.com.